Today, Dark Magazine welcomes a special guest speaker who is extensively published, specialising in the culture and politics of the Australian publishing industry. She recently delivered the keynote address for the Small Press Network Conference Academic Day, resulting in much tweeting. Welcome, Dr. Anne Richards.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I start, I'd just like to make one comment. When Peter Temple and John Curtin established the first postgrad publishing and editing degree at RMIT in 1988, they did the Australian industry a great service. An experienced far-sighted publisher, John Curtin was determined to ensure that this course was offered part-time so that students already working with the industry could be involved and take advantage of the course. Okay, and this still remains its focus, as Michael Webster assured me. This close link between the industry and the academy was encouraged by both the APA and the local Society of Editors here. These courses are now offered in over 10 universities across Australia. So it is not surprising to witness the many startup operations that, with both electronic and print agendas, promising a new wave of independent publishing platforms, and this is exciting, I think. The SPN conference itself is a further testament to this dynamic intersection between the industry and the academy. Okay, moving on. Today I'm going to talk about coming out, reframing the public face of publishing. The author is dead, the book is dead, the publisher is dead, the reader lives in the ultimate democratic universe. While some analysts applaud the death of the book, the traditional book, and what they regard as its commercialised elitist industry, others lament the implications of this revolution, fearing the death of long text narrative and the death of public discourse. In fact, in the current state of emergency, fear tends to rule the whole discourse of traditional publishing and its associated industries. One reason for this is that fear and calamity have assumed a commodity value in the public sphere. There is an instant attention grab, exciting an emotional response when the word death is used, or when that deep voice whispers, "Be afraid, be very afraid." It might only last an instant, but that blip is on the screen. The terms are particularly unsettling when applied to the sacred "God is dead," to sacral values "liberty is dead," or to the established social order "democracy is dead." It is also now applied to entrenched cultural objects and institutions. The book is dead, and therefore, of course, publishing is dead. It is not the scandalous death of the Lady of the Night that will ruin a young prince, but a death that will cause sacrosanct institutions to crumble. As Hanrahan said, "We'll all be ruined." Today, I will argue that this fear dialogue has created a crisis of confidence in the publishing industry and its many participants. While some shrug off the negative labels or argue opposing logistics, the Australian industry will benefit by a makeover, a more empowering discourse and self-perception. Analysts argue that if you want to make the right decisions for the future, fear is a very poor consultant. More specifically, Rieger insists that fear leads companies to destroy themselves from within. Publishing firms, individually and collectively, need to vault across the fault lines and create a positive framework to assault the future, which is, after all, still unwritten. So where did the death discourse come from? When Roland Barthes announced the death of the author, it was an incendiary moment. Like Jason Bourne's Identity Quest, it set off a chain reaction, claiming lives previously untouchable and demolishing entrenched ideologies. When Foucault then posed the challenge, what does it matter who is speaking? There was another flurry of heated response. Derrida and others swung into the debate, and further disrupting traditional notions of the text, its languages and its authors. Academics sharpened their wits and rebooted their vocabulary. These debates made headlines and reputations. They also created a subgenre of literary criticism that has importantly sold a great many academic books. Sean Burke is correct in more ways than one when he states in The Death and Return of the Author that the concept of the author is never more alive than when pronounced dead. And I would like to make a few comments about the return factor. Recent work by John Logie and Jane Gallop highlights some relevant issues concerning Barth's infamous essay. John Logie uncovers a Barth persona largely unheralded. In recontextualising the essay within the art multimedia package where it was first published in 1967, he claims that the circumstances of its composition make it clear that it was never meant to be a traditional scholarly essay. Barth as participant and essay as chunk are subsumed into a broader artistic happening that was presented in the minimalism issue of Aspen, the magazine in a box. From 1965 to 71, Aspen delivered each issue in boxes of various shapes and sizes. The boxes housed an array of print artefacts, records, music scores, videos, games, cardboard cutouts. There were contributions from John Cale and John Cage, Kate Millett, Susan Sontag, Yoko Ono, Samuel Beckett, William Burroughs. There was a pocket diary of the future by John Lennon and papers on LSD by Timothy Leary. The third issue of Aspen, on pop art, arrived in what appeared to be a fab detergent carton, designed, of course, by Andy Warhol. Marshall McLuhan presided over one issue, and video artist Namjoon Paik pointed out several issues later that McLuhan's biggest inconsistency was that he still writes books. Aspen was not a high academic, lofty tower setting for what would become a seminal scholarly article. Barth's essay was commissioned specifically for this issue dedicated to Mallarmé and was released in a network of artistic provocations. Logie argues that it remains a deeply site-specific piece of writing. Jane Gallop argues that while the author might have died in 1967, Barth presided over a friendly return just 2 years later. Barth found that in the text he desired the author's presence. The author who returns is not the institutional cafe author, but one who comes out of his text and into our lives. However, this friendly return occurred in the least known of Barth's works, on Sade, Fourier and Rayola. Gallop makes the salient point that the author dies in an overexposed Barth and returns in an underexposed Barth, the imbalance in the reception of the text tending to obscure the return and exaggerating the finality of the death. This imbalance supports the ongoing privileging of the death discourse. The tragic fate of the author also serves as an accepted precursor of the death of the book. It is as if the institutional sentinels inhibiting the free flow of the text to the reader's understanding were falling, and that this should be applauded. The book has limited the contours of the text, its embellishment, its dimensionality. It also limited the answering back of the reader, since all things must now be immediate. Most accounts of the death of the book also assume the death of the publisher as an inevitable consequence. I was mistakenly thinking that the publishing industry died in 2011, when the bells were tolling. But the Google Guide led me to an article announcing that the publishing industry died last week on the 12th of June 2008, and I was quite unaware of that. So death rules the discussion, as Derrida lamented, as if one could add more deaths to death and thus indecently pluralise it. But are any of these deaths real, or have we indecently pluralised death to further erode the current publishing scene? Or is it true? Are we allowing the already dead a sort of survivance, a kind of living on not only after their death, their actual death, but even before, as if they were already living on posthumously before their death? This discourse has a very real impact. One of the negatives of this constant airing of death across the literary sphere is that the industry and its people live in a constant state of crisis. There is a disturbing book of essays called Cultures of Insecurity, States, Communities and the Production of Danger. When a nation, a culture, a community, or I would suggest an industry, lives in crisis mode, fear takes over as a primary driver of discourse. Extensive studies in change management and crisis management indicate that while a state of crisis generates a sense of urgency and reduces complacency, fear can cause paralysis, narrow vision and restrict decision-making processes. Fear is an enemy of creativity, and in a creative industry, this is doubly damaging. Ongoing fear can be paralysing to a workplace, demoralising personnel, causing staff to be self-protective, driving them under their desks, as Cotter consistently argues. I'll illustrate this with two brief examples. The first is from the book fair, Australian Book Fair in 2000, which was usually a 3-day event. The pavilion was forsaken on the last day as booksellers rushed back to their stores to preside over the dominant book event of the year, which was the release of Harry Potter 4. This was certainly a bleak day for Australian publishing. It meant that no one was going to buy anything else that month, and few other conversations were worth continuing. Eeyore walked the emptying aisles. As one commentator remarked, publishing is one of those businesses that is brilliant at thinking it's perpetually at crisis point. Several years later, at an APA closed-door seminar in 2007, the staging was solemn. There was floor-to-ceiling black drapes, 20 foot high, a long table for presenters skirted in these big black flounces. 4 eminently serious publishers, all dressed in black. Richard Flanagan, as the guest author, wore the only white shirt. Nearly all attending editors and publishers were also dressed in black. It would have been rude to take photos, but it was more than a little disconcerting. Where are your colours? It would seem that the industry is stuck looking through an obituary frame with a jaded gaze. The resultant culture of insecurity can limit opportunities and innovative solutions. The whole sphere of activity can be contaminated with negative dialogue despite ongoing individual or group achievement, contrary situational analysis, or animated grand gestures of future's optimism. So fear still rules. Of course, it all depends on the individual workplace and the level of acceptance of this state of play. It depends on a firm's driving agenda. It also depends on the culture of the local industry and the language it uses to legitimise its existence. But there is truth in the statement that publishers have been utterly crap at explaining what they do, and most of what they do is intrinsically invisible. There is a ghosting of publishing professionals written into the literary sphere that is arguably disempowering in our highly visible everything out there contemporary culture. There is a complex psychology at work in this industry, and the publishing persona deserves a quick examination. One of the defining narratives of the role of the publisher is as an enabling agent. The publisher provides a platform but remains at a distance, a retiring backdrop for the creative spark in the industry, the author. While there are strong justifications for this retiring disposition, which are steeped in tradition, there are negatives as well. One obvious explanation lies in the culture-commerce divide. While the author is the genius, the publisher is the exploiter of their copyright, the capitalist of the book world, the Shylock whose underlying intention is predatory and who might just cut out your heart. Extreme, I know, but this imagery is written into the historical narrative of the industry and still reappears. The publisher is also the powerful multinational exploiter of the nation's intellectual property, governed by greed and the bottom line, caring little for the local literary milieu. The corporation deals in money and power, books are the commodity. But this narrative is also debatable, and the multinats are now locked in their own struggle for survival. These giants must become stronger still or face demolition by the internet moguls, Amazon, Apple and Google, and the as yet unknown rising supernova, and there always is one. And these corporations really don't care about books. All these power games are played in the upper stratosphere, and few publishers we know, or publishing houses we know, live there. While the consequences of their clashes filter through to impact the local industry, this is not the game played by the drivers of our industry, the small and medium firms. Another aspect of the publishing persona is that the publisher is guarded in disclosure. There is a culture of secrecy that governs in-house activities, and again, this is understandable. Selection processes are firmly rooted in the publisher as gatekeeper role, which is often contentious. Publishers and commissioning editors exert considerable power in the selection of a text and its author. There is a complex layering of intangible values operating here, and these are difficult transactions to define or measure. There is no standard formula, and if there is one, it's a well-kept secret. The ethos of the publisher also incorporates a culture of discretion, a respect for the privacy of the author in the throes of giving birth to their book. Books are contracted at different levels of completion, and birthing can be a painful process. Some memories demand a delete. Dramas between authors and publishers are rarely disclosed or not in full. The culture of discretion can extend to the contents of the text. Some books require a cloak of secrecy since they might be controversial, inflammatory, or textually experimental. Publishers and editors are discreet, the keepers of many secrets. Another driving narrative concerns the role of the editor as the invisible mender of the text. This collusion between the author and editor adding value to the text is an essential but invisible process. There is a ghosting of the editor written into the showcase identity of the publishing house, which is another subscript accepted across the industry. So looking at this list, it is not surprising at all that publishing professionals can feel disempowered and frustrated. In a society that has never had a strong appreciation of the value of the arts, as in most European countries, this invisibility within an always contested local industry presents a double jeopardy challenge. I am currently involved on a collaborative project with German academics on contemporary publishing. In early discussions, it was difficult for my colleagues to understand the contested position of the industry here in Australia. This is, of course, the result of the very different book histories of the two countries. But I found myself having to explain these differences very carefully, and I'll very quickly include the central arguments here. The printing press was a German invention. The first printed Bibles displayed at the Frankfurt Fair in 1455. So the first books, as well as printing expertise, spread out across Europe from there. A vibrant trade in illuminated manuscripts had been conducted at the Frankfurt Fair since the 12th century. The German industry has no need to justify its existence to either the government or to the general population. The book industry has been traditionally entrenched, culturally validated, and financially sustainable for over 500 years. This is certainly not the case in Australia, where the industry still struggles to justify its importance to government, cultural and institutional bodies. This is a time-consuming, frustrating process with little long-term gain. Any ground won in one decade or under one government is too often lost with the next financial meltdown. An additional struggle stems from Australian colonial history and the long journey to legitimise Australian authors and locally produced books. Henry Lawson bemoaned the popularity of what he termed thievish imported rags as the major cause of the failure of Australian literature in 1894. George Robertson was deeply discouraged in the 1920s, announcing that after 30 years endeavouring to do what he could for Australian literature, A&R would turn to the much more profitable and infinitely less arduous task of selling British and American books. By 1953, there were still only 3 publishers, A&R, MUP and Cheshire, who produced more than 10 titles a year. Now this was only 60 years ago. It was not until the 1970s and 80s that reading habits of Australians shifted to buying quality Australian books. By the mid-1990s, sometimes 60% of titles, all book titles, books bought here were Australian titles. Now the internet is changing not only the container, but reading habits and consumer patterns. My final comment to my German colleagues was, this sounds like a really sad story, but it's not. This is just basic information about the industry. Our authors, artists and publishers do great things. Our industry is actually an amazing success story, which deserves to be celebrated, which is something we don't do particularly well. One strategy that probably helped is dancing, because hard times require furious dancing. However, there are other methods of approach. Certainly the fracturing of traditional associations of content with the book container is a radical disruption. In addition, the abundance of content online increases the pressure on the industry to create new and more effective methods of marketing content-rich products. There are indeed many points of crisis, but it's not the apocalypse. You've got to get perspective. It is wise to remember the Schillingsburg argument that authorship, printing and publishing have always been enmeshed in a complex of economic traditions and interests, in a continuous struggle with innovation, both technical and moral, and with attitudes, particularly as they reflect their audiences. And Schillingsburg was writing about 19th century Britain. So innovation and attitudes have always been key determinants of the publishing industry. The ground is unstable, and this is unlikely to change. Every tertiary business course is currently teaching that change is the only constant for the future. In an innovation-driven environment, adaptability is becoming a primary driver, giving what is now termed an evolutionary advantage. For adaptability to function successfully, the fear mindset has to significantly downsize. As I indicated earlier, fear is a dangerous consultant and can actually fuel a self-destruction process in an organisation. Now, recent research on entrepreneurial motivation indicates that fear does 2 things. It reduces the tendency to exploit a presenting opportunity, and it also reduces the tendency to evaluate a presenting opportunity positively, and this is highly significant. This research on motivation in entrepreneurs is complex, carefully mapping attitudes, emotions, behaviours, decision-making processes and outcomes. In the important evaluation process, a high level of fear before a manuscript is read or meeting attended is likely to produce a negative response, a negative exploitation value. A high level of joy gives a more positive outcome, a positive exploitation value. Anger also works. So if you can't get the joy thing happening, get into the anger if you want to get the positive outcome. So decisions are not made in pure waters, or in French theory speak, are not defined by a pure confrontation with pure possibles. Small and medium publishers, SMPs, are indeed facing economic stringencies, which means that everyone is being challenged to think outside the box. But the box is not the book, the box is our limited mindset. I would suggest that 2 pivotal points for ongoing success are adaptability and attitudes. In order to maximise successful outcomes from adaptability strategies, a company or an industry must be secure in its mission and its foundational strengths. My previous research demonstrates that SMPs in Australia do have a very strong sense of mission, which is clearly and forcefully articulated. So I'm just going to turn and concentrate on core strengths. It is here that the Kierkegaardian notion of upbuilding can strengthen both the ethos and capability of an organisation, its foundational strengths. Nielsen explains that instead of a crisis being defined as how to change an organisation so that it can more prosperously adjust to an external environment, the problem is, in a sense, reversed. The problem can be reframed in order to simultaneously maintain, stimulate and enable the organisation's ethical tradition, while still dealing with the problem, of course. In this way, a company can both respond more creatively to crises and strengthen its own ethical traditions, its foundational strengths. An upbuilding perspective, and it doesn't matter what term you use, just grab hold of the concept, reframes a crisis dialogue. The current paradigmatic shift creates an opportunity to reframe the positive languages and enabling logics of a highly functional, though invisible, cultural ethos within a publishing house. And do note here that the choice of what is enabling and what is dysfunctional is totally yours and will probably change over time. Language is always political and is actioned in everyday practice. Attitudes and inherent behaviours can work creatively to expedite organisational operations. Within a company, individual staff do take account of structural and emotional circumstances, and there is often a self-conscious positioning within an intellectual and creative space. The fact is that the level of personal commitment is always variable, and as Blaney observed, principles are often bruised by daily pressures and occupational hazards. The grip of the grind takes its toll. The centrality of an in-house culture in influencing the attitudes and behaviours of staff as active participants, both with their own responsibilities and within a broader cultural context, should not be underestimated. Each publishing house is a space for creative action. While the mission across houses can differ significantly, there is an overall theory of practice here predicated on a belief in the cultural and political value of literary practice, and it is also political. There is a strong commitment to an aesthetics of value and to a broader social good that drives in-house operations and outcomes. One simple word to describe the complex motivations behind this industry is the old-fashioned but newly located word, passion. Interestingly, passion as a driver of entrepreneurial success in both profit and not-for-profit organisations is now an area of intense research, drawing together academic studies in management, psychology, economics and marketing. Substantial research on passion in entrepreneurs indicates that it creates pride, enthusiasm, energy, the drive to consistently complete challenging tasks to a high standard. It is an emotional resource for coping with and overcoming obstacles. Passion generates drive, tenacity, a willingness to work long hours, courage, high levels of initiative, and persistence in the face of obstacles. Now, these are all characteristics of the publishing industry. For the poetic amongst us, passion promotes intense flow-like states of total absorption in one's activities. Passion involves feelings that are hot, overpowering, and suffused with the fire of desire. These comments are all made in very dry research papers, replete with statistical tables, diagrams, charts. So, as you can see, passion is a very complex, plotting passion is a very complex task. The relationships between all these different factors are mathematically calculated. The connection between persistence or problem solving and opportunity recognition and then exploitation outcomes are all clearly plotted and are given a statistical value. Passion is not an outmoded word, it is being newly legitimised, it is being reframed. My argument is that the publishing industry in Australia would not exist at all without this essential ingredient. It is possibly the biggest resource that SMPs have available, and it has its own battery charger. Activities in the literary field and its enabling publishing houses were traditionally justified by altruistic agendas alongside commercial motivations, of course. These altruistic commitments have been devalued by dominant economic criteria and discouraged by the death discourse and its rhetoric of fear. Nevertheless, passion, commitment, a joy of working in a creative environment, a love of the text, of books, a sense of obligation to make some contribution are all completely valid motivational drivers as the business sector is discovering. This is the creative fire of desire within a cultural industry, and also, I would suggest, within humanities faculties within the university. Our local industry needs an injection of passion steroids into its creative culture and languages. Publishers, editors, marketers on steroids are required. Pumped up, bronzed, oiled, tech-savvy and brazen. Go for it. And publishers coming out as fearless entrepreneurs might not have the same retiring disposition. They do not have to dress in black. They have more fun. They celebrate and encourage not only their authors, but each other. So reframe the industry as the happy drug. Remember, in publishing, anything can happen. I would also suggest that it might require more than one steroidic intervention to cope with the deluge of authors, diversity of container options, writing styles and multimodal formats of a supersaturated, clouded marketplace. The author personage is multiplying rapidly. The dramatic increase in the number of people with higher levels of social, cultural and intellectual capital means that there is a justifiable increase in the number of writers capable of creating long-form narratives. Traditionally, the author wrote with the expectation of finding readers. Now readers want to be authors too. This expansion and shift in the pool of writers will grow with the next generation. This is a generation that will not sit through the qualifying rounds seeking some element of legitimisation before tagging themselves as book author. They have been endorsed throughout their short careers. A strong element of narcissism is written into this next individualistic culture, which is now being charted, and one of my colleagues has done some great work on this. There are both positive and negative features, but it's obvious that self-publishing is becoming an extension of social media for this can't-wait generation. And this is fine. Self-published authors are now finding that what they also crave is readers, that it is not enough to release their book into the public sphere. The next step of recognition that something of value has been contributed is desired. The endorsement of value might be supplied by strong sales, positive reviews, or different forms of social confirmation, such as Facebook likes, website feedback, or tweets, for those more at home with a tweet than a metaphor. Self-publishing is actually a hard road to travel long term, unless the author already has a substantial network, established platform, or a broader commitment to a cause or a genre. A recent author survey indicated that nearly half the self-published authors consulted wanted to score a trade book deal. Only 12% were not interested in their self-journal. An additional exposure on the horizon is the newly educated millions from Africa and Asia who are beginning to write long text narratives. These stories are going to be extraordinary, whether or not they are well written, and many of them will be beautifully written. This should be hugely exciting for publishers. The Big Five recognise this and are now buying up smaller publishing houses throughout India, for example. There are moves on Africa. There is a plaintive article on publishing in Nigeria online, which really deserves a response. I would like to suggest adopting a publishing author. often collaborate on an English Nigerian or Indonesian project, fund a scholarship, adopt a foreign student while they're here and train them, send out a scout. Certainly there is a lack of funds here and a lack of time, but there is no lack of expertise in Australia, and I urge you to be generous and to share it. The challenge remains to develop models and pathways for authors to present their best work in an easily accessible container and to find readers who will both buy and recommend their book, whatever the format. This is the traditional role of the publisher. The publishing house must nurture its own in-house culture, valuing expertise and innovation in staff. The expertise of the editor in spotting and shaping a good story will remain critical to the industry, as will providing authors with that professional critique to assist in developing their literary skills, and this is essential. The diversity of Australian stories has been recognised and endorsed over the last 60 years, but the importance of a wide range of publishing platforms to release the next wave of stories and information remains absolutely vital. In a time when fear seems to rule most political discourse in a sea of muddied and ignorant slogans, there has never been a more urgent need for courageous publishing initiatives. A nation has never built a prosperous, equitable future on a dialogue of fear. There are at least 23 million reasons why Australia needs a strong publishing industry. Finally, I have argued that the author did not die, but returned in a different, more friendly way 2 years later. The book is not dead, just morphing and playing around. It is a trifle uncontained and causing anxiety. Perhaps it is merely adolescent. It's a long road. Publishing isn't dead, but is having some major identity issues. There is a need for regrouping and reframing. It is also important to remember our history and our achievements. Publishers should aspire to live in the future tense, really. It is impossible to keep up with the ever-vanishing present, and that is no reason to be afraid. It might also be useful to know that by coming out as passionate publishers and arts academics, statistically, you will have a high positive and therefore relevant correlation coefficient. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Anne.
Thank you very much.